Lately, a number of viewers have been asking me questions about wine travel to various wine regions around the world. So, in this video, I thought I would share my strategies and some tips that I found useful when I plan my own trips to wine country. I've been going on wine trips for more than 17 years now, and I go on at least 4 to 5 different wine trips per year. In all, I visited more than 400 different wineries in more than 70 different wine producing regions worldwide. So this is definitely something about which I have lots of experience, and I've learned a lot along the way. Sometimes I've learned things the hard way. So if you watch this video and apply the 11 tips that I've learned along the way, I definitely think that you'll make the most of your time in wine country and have the very best trip possible. When planning a successful trip to wine country, the first thing that you want to do is start planning early. The earlier you reach out to wineries, the more likely it is that they're going to be able to accommodate your request for a visit. Conversely, the longer you wait, the more likely it is that they're going to be booked for that particular day, or you're not going to be able to get the time slot that you want. Certainly, the need to start early will vary a little bit depending on how busy the particular destination is. But when I'm going to a place like Bordeaux or Napa Valley, someplace that gets lots of wine travelers, I definitely want to start planning no later than 3 months before my trip. And honestly, I personally start planning a little bit earlier than that, just because I don't want to take any chances. With as much as these wine trips cost, and as few times as you're able to visit particular regions, I personally never want the reason that I was not able to visit a particular winery to be just the fact that I procrastinated and sat on my hands too long before reaching out to various wineries. The next tip for planning a successful trip to wine country is to consider traveling during the off-season. While it's certainly fun to see the winemaking equipment in operation or to visit when everything is lush and green in the peak of the summer season, the problem with that is that everything is also expensive and it's quite congested. But if you book during the off-season, you'll find an easier time scheduling bookings for not only wineries, but also for flights, hotels, and restaurants. And during the off-season, certainly flights and definitely hotels are typically much less expensive than they are during the peak season as well. In addition, because the winery owners and the winemaking team is usually extraordinarily busy during harvest, you have virtually no opportunity to meet with any of them if you visit during harvest. But you have a much better chance of potentially having that happen if you visit during the off-season. Also, in places like Napa Valley, traffic can be extraordinarily congested during peak season. So if you want to do something like turn left, you'll definitely want to visit during the off-season. While I'm normally a more is better guy and someone who thinks that anything worth doing is worth overdoing, I've learned that when visiting wine country, it's important not to try to do too much. This is something I definitely learned the hard way. During my first trip to Napa Valley, for example, I learned which wineries opened the earliest and which ones stayed open the longest, and then I raced from tasting room to tasting room to try to get in as many visits as humanly possible during the operating hours in which the wineries were open. Of course, that approach was problematic for numerous reasons, the least of which is the fact that that's just too much wine to have in one day, especially if you're going to be having dinner and lunch. And also now that tasting fees have gotten up there in terms of price in some wine regions, it's also extremely expensive. More importantly, however, it's also a better idea to emphasize quality over quantity. A never-ending stream of tasting rooms gets to be a little bit monotonous and boring. And so I found that it's much better to focus on more detailed visits where you have opportunities to do things like tour the winery, tour the vineyard, learn about the winemaking and grape growing process, taste a number of wines, including perhaps some older vintages, and maybe even do some barrel tasting or other unique experiences as well. Certainly those experiences are far more memorable and rewarding than tasting room visits, but they are also more time consuming. And so I typically will schedule one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And I found that that also allows time for a nice lunch in between, and that you have time to rest up before you go to dinner. Typically, the only time I'll do a third visit in one day is if I need to for scheduling purposes, or if there's an opportunity to combine a visit with lunch. Certainly in wine regions like Mendoza, Argentina, it's not at all uncommon for wineries to have restaurants on their property as well, and you can do your tasting at the same time that you enjoy a meal. This is also something that's common in places like Australia. In the United States, it's unfortunately quite rare for wineries to be able to have restaurants on their property as well, so it's not typical to be able to have lunch with your visit. But there are wineries where it's possible to enjoy a picnic during lunch at the winery as well. And I've certainly taken advantage of that at places like the Ridge Montebello Winery, at Pride in Spring Mountain in Napa Valley, and at Christum in Willamette Valley. Before moving on to the next tip, just in terms of making sure that you don't have too much wine in one day, it's also extremely important for you to be able to learn how to taste wine and then spit. I know, especially for female wine enthusiasts, this is sometimes problematic and they don't feel good about spitting the wine. But it's much better, in my opinion, to be able to taste the wine and then spit it out, rather than just taking one small sip of a nice pour and then dumping out the rest of a very expensive wine. One of the most important things that you can do to ensure a smooth and successful trip to wine country is to cluster your appointments geographically. And typically that means that when I'm scheduling appointments for one day, I'll stay in basically the same geographic location so that I'm not having to travel more than 10 to 15 minutes from one of my winery appointments to lunch or vice versa. This is especially critical during peak season or times when there's heavy traffic. Inevitably, what happens is if you have to get a long ways in a short time, such as from someplace like Saint-Estèphe in Bordeaux, all the way to Pessac-Léognan, that could take at least 45 minutes or more, even without traffic. But of course, since wine country typically involves farming activity, it's not uncommon to get behind slow-moving vehicles like tractors, or to have just heavy congestion on the roads, and for trips to take much longer than you anticipate. So for that reason, when I'm scheduling trips, I'll cluster my trips by day. So if we're talking about Napa Valley, for example, I'll do one day on one of the mountains, either Howell Mountain or Spring Mountain or Mount Veeder, for example. Then I'll schedule another day where I can do visits on the valley floor, such as in Oakville and Rutherford, and perhaps another day where I'm doing visits in an area like Calistoga in nearby St. Helena. That helps to ensure that you stay on schedule and that you don't run late for any of your appointments. During this video, I've spent a lot of time talking about the importance of making appointments and doing so as early as possible. But recently, a viewer asked me a great question, which is whether it's possible to just be totally spontaneous and rely on drop-in visits when you arrive in wine country. While that used to be something that was definitely possible, especially before the pandemic, since that time, my experience has been that most wineries prefer appointments at this time, and it would be extremely unusual to be able to fill your schedule and get some outstanding experiences by relying exclusively on drop-in visits. That's particularly true because the places that allow drop-in visits are typically places that have only tasting room experiences available. That does not mean that you should entirely ignore drop-in visits, however. I've found that they can be a very useful supplement to your schedule. And so what I like to do when I'm planning a trip is once I get my schedule planned and I have my visit planned for a particular area in the morning and the afternoon, I'll also identify a place that will allow a drop-in visit, either that's close to my last visit of the day or perhaps close to the hotel where I'm staying. In that way, if my last visit finishes early or I still have some time before dinner, I can just drop in unplanned and be totally spontaneous. For those of you who want to visit some of the most historic, prestigious wineries in the world, this next tip is for you. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. If you're trying to schedule visits at some of the most exclusive, prestigious wineries in the entire world, it's important that you have a thick skin and that you don't get upset in the event of rejection. In fact, I like to say that if you're not being told no, you're not trying hard enough. Or, as Wayne Gretzky said, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. And in fact, even to this day, when I'm planning wine trips, there's always at least one winery that will either tell me no or just ignore my request entirely. But I don't let that bother me. Instead, I realize that it's a numbers game, and if you reach out to enough high quality wineries, you'll end up with an incredible schedule. So at the outset, what I like to do is typically for each different area that I'm visiting, I'll come up with a list of 3 to 4 wineries and then prioritize them by ranking from 1 to 4. Once I'm done with that process, I'll start sending out my requests for visit in waves, starting with the places that I have rated number 1 on my list. I'll then wait for their responses to come in, or wait a reasonable time for them to ignore the request, and then I'll move on to the next one. If they say yes, you can mark that down on your schedule and confirm it and move on to the next one. Likewise, if they say no, just go ahead and move on to the second one and don't worry about it. If you just repeat this process until you have a full schedule, you'll definitely have some visits that you really enjoy. Of course, with some of the top wineries in the world, it can be extremely difficult to get visits, especially if they're not a place that's typically open to the public. In that situation, there's a couple different approaches you can take. Certainly, if you're someone who's in the wine business, I would definitely mention that when you reach out to the winery, as oftentimes wineries will accommodate requests from those who are in the industry. Another thing you can try to do is if you're a collector and you buy a lot of wine for a particular winery, then I would see if the distributor can get involved and make a request for a visit on your behalf. But I would also caution you that it's not always the biggest wineries or the biggest names that provide the best visits. Sometimes you're much better off going to a smaller winery where you may have some contact with the winemaker or one of the owners who are extremely passionate and who are very happy to welcome guests to their winery. Another pro tip for you is when you're attending events like the James Suckling wine tastings, or if you have other opportunities to meet winery representatives at various wine dinners or wine tastings wherever you might live, definitely ask for their business card, as that will be extremely handy in the event that you're planning a visit to that wine region, and they can often help you to secure a visit, and a visit that's maybe much more exclusive and enjoyable than what someone who's just writing in cold might be able to receive. When you're visiting a particular wine region, you'll also want to have a general sense as to the type of visit that you can expect in terms of whether or not there'll be a tasting fee or not, and whether it will be more of a sales-oriented approach or more of an educational approach. When you're visiting Bordeaux, for example, a lot of the wineries there don't even sell their wine direct to consumer, so when you visit, you may not even pay a tasting fee, and they'll probably focus more on education and telling you about the winery's history and approach to winemaking than anything else. In contrast, when you visit a winery in the United States, that's typically a sales opportunity for that winery, and their goal will be to get you to become a member of their mailing list or their wine club. There's also most likely going to be a tasting fee associated with that visit, unless you're already a member of their wine club or mailing list, in which case they may waive the fee, or if it's one of the wineries that will allow you to waive or partially reduce the amount of the fee that you pay for the tasting with a purchase of wine during that visit. One way that I found to keep expenses low when visiting places like Napa Valley is to schedule visits with wineries where I'm either a member or on their mailing list, and at the same time I'll often travel with other friends who may be members of mailing lists or wine clubs for different wineries, and then we can each get each other in the door and exchange free visits in that way. And that oftentimes helps to reduce tasting fees. For those situations where you visit a winery that waives a tasting fee with purchase and you've enjoyed your visit to the winery, I strongly recommend that you go ahead and purchase wine so you can get your tasting fees waived. Another strategy that I found to be very useful when planning trips to wine country is to try to schedule my visits on weekdays rather than on the weekends. In many wine regions, such as Bordeaux and other places in Europe, the top wineries won't be open on the weekends. Similarly, in places like Napa Valley, it's often the most touristy wineries that are open on the weekends, and certainly both the winery and the wine region will be busier and more congested on the weekend as well. Plus, there's no difference in tasting wine on a weekday or the weekend, so why not do it during the week when more of the wineries are open and it will be a little bit less busy and less congested? When planning a trip to wine country, I will also sometimes take into account the availability of wine bars. Oftentimes, if you schedule an afternoon visit at 2 or 2:30, it's going to be difficult for you to get another visit in before dinner and after that afternoon visit is complete. And if you go back to the room, if you're like me, you may be concerned that you end up taking a nap and that you'll sleep through dinner. So what I sometimes like to do is visit a wine bar where I can try some flights of wines that I may not be able to experience otherwise during that visit, and that will sometimes bridge the gap for an hour or two before dinner. One of the things I like to do when I'm visiting a wine region is for those wineries where I'm not able to get a visit, but I'm certainly very interested in trying their wines. What I will do is I'll look for those wines on the restaurant wine lists. As they say, what grows together goes together, and so you can expect that many of the restaurants in the wine region that you're visiting will have substantial collections of local wines on their wine list, including many back vintages and oftentimes much more favorable pricing than what you'll see anywhere else. While BYO is not generally permitted in places like Europe, to the extent you're in the United States, another thing that I found to be useful is where you go to a particular winery and purchase wine to get your tasting fees waived, you can also sometimes bring that wine to a restaurant that has a corkage policy and enjoy that wine at dinner. And certainly when you're in places like Mendoza, Argentina, I strongly recommend that you check out some of the wineries that have top-notch restaurants. My particular favorite was Zuccardi, and that's an absolute must visit when you're in Mendoza. They say that no one needs a vacation more than someone who just returned from vacation. And that was certainly my experience for a number of whirlwind trips, especially when I was younger. But I've since learned the importance of building in some downtime. I had one particularly painful visit that drove this point home forcefully, and which has caused me to prioritize the importance of building in downtime ever since. During 2019, I had the opportunity to schedule a last-minute trip to Piedmont during truffle season. Despite the fact that it was somewhat last-minute notice, and I would only have a few days there, and it was also a very busy time period, I nevertheless went ahead and did it anyway. I was able to come up with some pretty good visits, but unfortunately, due to the fact that it was a pretty busy time period, I could only spend one night at my top hotel. Following a grueling 15-hour trip from Dallas, Texas to Barolo, I was absolutely shocked and impressed once I saw the hotel. It had stunning views overlooking the vineyard. It would have been the perfect place to sit down and enjoy a nice bottle of Barolo, and that's exactly what I wanted to do following that trip. Unfortunately, however, we had to race off to a winery visit and thus had time to do nothing more than just dump our stuff off in our rooms, take a couple pictures of the vineyard, and race off to our visit. By the time we returned, it was already dark and we had a dinner appointment, followed by breakfast and an early checkout time to make it to another winery visit the next day. Ever since then, I've made it a point to prioritize downtime during my visits. I've also found that it's well worth it to prioritize booking a nice hotel that has outstanding views and where you can enjoy a nice bottle of wine on the patio, or perhaps a rental house where you're able to grill or prepare your meals and enjoy those meals at the house with some of the wine that you purchased during your trip. If you're interested in visiting Napa Valley, be sure to check out this video where I recommend some of my favorite wineries to visit where you can get experiences other than just tasting room visits.